By the summer of 1780, Britain believed the American Revolution was over. Charleston had fallen. Camden had ended in disaster. The Continental Army in the South had collapsed. On every official map, South Carolina belonged to the British Empire. But maps can lie. Because hidden inside the swamps of South Carolina was a 50-year-old farmer with barely 70 men. And over the next 2 years, he would force one of the greatest armies on earth to fight an enemy it could never catch. The British captured the cities. They held the forts. They controlled the roads. Yet somehow, they never controlled the country. This is the story of Francis Marion, the swamp fox, and how a handful of farmers proved that occupying land is not the same as ruling it. This story is not really about one man. It is about a strategic miscalculation so fundamental that it unraveled an entire military campaign. Britain's southern strategy was built on a simple assumption: defeat the Continental Army in the south, garrison the major towns, build a network of fortified outposts across the interior, and the countryside, vast, rural, and seemingly without organized resistance, would fall into place behind the armies. It was a logical plan. It had worked in other wars. It was supported by every conventional military calculation available to British commanders in 1780. It failed because of one thing the British never fully accounted for: the people who lived in those swamps, those rivers, those pine barrens. They were not simply terrain to be crossed. They were an intelligence network, a supply system, a fighting force that could appear, strike, and dissolve back into the landscape before any response was possible. Marion did not defeat Britain's southern strategy. He exposed it. Before we go any further, if you have ever wondered why occupying armies throughout history keep losing to smaller forces they should be able to crush, this video is going to give you the clearest answer you have ever heard. Subscribe right now, because this is the kind of history that explains not just 1780, but every insurgency that has come since. To understand why Britain's southern strategy failed, you first have to understand why it looked so promising. By the spring of 1780, the British had made a strategic decision to shift the war's focus to the southern colonies. The northern campaign had stalled. Washington's army at Valley Forge had been transformed by Steuben into something far more professional than the British had expected. A decisive victory in the north was no longer achievable quickly. But the South was different. The South had a large loyalist population, or so British intelligence suggested. The Carolinas and Georgia were full of colonists who had never fully embraced the revolutionary cause, who maintained commercial and cultural ties to Britain, and who would support a return to royal authority if given the protection to do so openly. The plan was elegant. Take the major ports, Savannah and Charleston, to control trade and supply lines. Establish a chain of fortified posts across the interior to hold the countryside and protect loyalist communities. Raise loyalist militia to supplement the regular army and police the regions between the garrisons, and then advance northward through the Carolinas into Virginia, rolling up the rebellion from south to north. In May of 1780, Charleston fell. Over 5,000 Continental soldiers surrendered, the worst American defeat of the entire war. In August, at Camden, General Horatio Gates led an army of 3,000 men against Cornwallis's force and was routed in less than an hour. The Continental Army in the South had effectively ceased to exist. Cornwallis stood in South Carolina in the late summer of 1780 and looked at a situation that appeared, by every conventional measure, to be exactly where the plan said it should be. The cities were British. The organized American armies were gone. The fortified outpost network was being built. The time had come to march north. What Cornwallis did not fully understand was that the plan had a flaw built into its very foundation. a flaw that a 50-year-old farmer with a limp was already in the process of exploiting. The flaw in Britain's southern strategy was the assumption that controlling territory and controlling a population were the same thing. They are not. An army can hold every city, garrison every crossroads, and patrol every river, and still lose if the people who live between those cities, crossroads, and rivers have decided they will not be ruled. The British had the towns, they had the roads, they had the forts. What they did not have was the trust, the cooperation, or the active support of enough of the population in South Carolina's interior to make their occupation anything more than a military exercise sustained entirely by force. And sustaining control entirely by force requires something that every empire eventually runs out of: enough soldiers. Francis Marion was born around 1732 in St. John's Parish, South Carolina, to a family of modest Huguenot descent. He was small and sickly as a child. He grew into a quiet, unremarkable plantation farmer, a man more comfortable managing rice fields and cattle than commanding men. His one piece of formal military experience came decades earlier, fighting Cherokee forces in the French and Indian War, a conflict that taught him something that would matter more than anyone could have predicted. He learned to fight in dense, unfamiliar terrain against an enemy that did not form up in neat lines. By 1779, Marion was in his late 40s and walking with a permanent limp from an injury he sustained jumping from a second-story window during a Charleston dinner party, a fracture that, in a stroke of grim luck, kept him away from Charleston when the city fell in May 1780, and away from Camden in August, when Gates's army was destroyed. While nearly every senior American commander in the South was being killed, captured, or scattered, Marion was recovering at a relative's home in North Carolina, his small force of irregulars intact. He was 50 years old. He had barely 70 men. He had no artillery, no supply chain worthy of the name, and no fortress to defend. He was also the only organized American military presence left in South Carolina. Pause here for a second. Britain has just crushed 2 Continental armies in 3 months. The most feared general in the British Army is planning his march north. The war in the South is over by every conventional measurement. And the man who is about to make that march impossible is eating sweet potatoes by a campfire in a swamp. Subscribe if you are not already here, because what Marion does next is not just a story about one man's cleverness. It is the story of exactly how overwhelming military power fails, and it is a pattern that has repeated itself in every major conflict for the last 200 years. Marion understood something that the British High Command never fully grasped. Occupying territory and controlling it are not the same thing. Cornwallis's strategy assumed that holding towns, garrisoning outposts, and defeating organized armies meant the countryside was secured. Marion understood that the swamps, rivers, and back roads the British considered impassable wilderness were, to men who had farmed and hunted there their whole lives, a highway, one that let him strike a target and disappear before any British response could be organized. The intelligence network came first. Marion built a web of local sympathizers, farmers, women who were rarely searched by British patrols, church members who passed messages between congregations, who fed him information about troop movements, supply convoys, and loyalist militia gathering points. This was not formal espionage with codes and dead drops. It was something rougher and, in its own way, more effective. A network of trust built farm by farm, family by family, across a region the British assumed was too rural and too scattered to organize. Women were particularly important. They moved freely, where men could not. They were questioned less and suspected later. A specific gate left open or closed, a particular hymn whistled to identify a friendly approach, a verbal message passed through a chain of neighbors. None of it would have impressed a European intelligence service. All of it worked because it was tailored precisely to terrain and relationships the British could never replicate. Once a target was identified, a supply wagon, a small garrison, a loyalist muster, Marion's men would gather at a pre-arranged rendezvous deep in the swamp. Snow's Island, a nearly inaccessible piece of high ground surrounded by the PD River, became his base. Connected to the mainland only by routes his men had scouted, and the British had not. The raids themselves were fast. Marion preferred dawn or dusk strikes, hitting a target hard with mounted men, inflicting maximum disruption in minutes, then withdrawing immediately, never holding ground, never lingering. The escape was the part that broke the British. Marion's columns would split into smaller groups the moment a raid concluded, each group peeling off toward a different swamp crossing, reconverging only at Snow's Island days later. Pursuing British cavalry would follow a trail that dissolved into water and reeds. One famous pursuit in November 1780 saw British Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, a man with a fearsome reputation for running down rebel forces, chase Marion's band for over 25 miles through the PD swamps without ever closing the distance. Tarleton eventually abandoned the pursuit in frustration. He reportedly dismissed his quarry with contempt, saying he refused to keep chasing the old swamp fox any further. A nickname meant as an insult. It became a badge of honor. Marion never engaged in pitched battle if he could avoid it. He attacked only when the odds clearly favored him. He taught his men to think the same way. Discipline over heroics, withdrawal over glory. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the first sustained American demonstrations of what would later be called guerrilla warfare, decades before the term existed. From Cornwallis's headquarters, the situation looked entirely different and entirely under control. 2 American field armies had been crushed in 3 months. Tarleton was the best cavalry commander in North America. The fortified outpost network was in place. The march north was being planned. Marion was not a serious strategic problem. He was an irritant, a handful of farmers who occasionally disrupted a supply convoy or freed a few prisoners. The British assumed that a man with no formal command structure, no artillery, no fixed base, and rarely more than a few dozen followers simply could not affect the outcome of a campaign decided by armies of thousands. That assumption was the entire vulnerability, because Marion was not trying to affect the outcome through pitched battle. He was affecting it through time, cost, and distraction. Every raid that required a British response diverted soldiers from Cornwallis's main force. Every garrison that had to be reinforced against partisan attack was a garrison that could not support the northern march. Every loyalist family that was raided and could not be protected by the British Army was a family that quietly reconsidered which side it was actually safe to support. The British were not losing battles, they were losing the countryside. And losing the countryside meant losing something they could not easily replace in a land they did not know the way Marion's men knew it. By late January 1781, Marion's raids had become so disruptive that the British dispatched a sizable force under Colonel Wellbore Ellis Doyle, specifically to locate and destroy his base at Snow's Island. Marion was alerted by his network days in advance. Picture the scene. Scouts arrive at the swamp's edge near midnight, breathless, reporting Doyle's column on the move. Marion gathers his officers in the dark by the dim light of a shielded fire. There is no debate about standing and fighting. The decision takes minutes. Supplies that can be carried are loaded onto horses. What cannot be moved, including a stockpile of ammunition and provisions that Marion's men had spent months accumulating, is destroyed rather than left for the British to find or use as bait. By dawn, the camp is empty. When Doyle's men finally reach Snow's Island, they find smoldering ruins and nothing else. No prisoners, no captured leader, no decisive victory to report back to Cornwallis. Marion's force has already scattered into smaller units across multiple swamp systems, reconvening later at a new unmarked location the British have no knowledge of. This is the moment that defined Marion's entire war. Not a dramatic charge, not a famous speech, a decision in the dark to lose ground rather than risk men, to let the British have their hollow tactical victory and give them nothing else. Within weeks, Marion's raids resumed elsewhere along the PD, as if Snow's Island had never mattered. The British had won a position and gained nothing. Here is what Marion's campaign actually accomplished, and it is more significant than most history books acknowledge. Operating with a force that rarely exceeded 70 men and was frequently far smaller, Marion tied down thousands of British and Loyalist troops across nearly 2 years of sustained partisan activity in South Carolina. He forced Cornwallis to divert cavalry, infantry, and command attention that the Northern campaign could not spare. Marion's brigade fought in more than 24 documented engagements between 1780 and 1782. He was never decisively defeated in the field. His base was never successfully destroyed with him in it, despite repeated dedicated British efforts specifically tasked with that goal. But the deeper damage was not in any single engagement. It was psychological and logistical. Cornwallis could never fully trust that his rear in the Carolinas was secure. Every supply convoy that moved through the interior did so under threat. Every Loyalist community that wanted British protection required troops to provide it, troops that were not advancing into Virginia. Every week that passed without the interior being pacified was another week the Continental Army, under Nathaniel Greene, was rebuilding, reorganizing, and preparing to fight again. Marion did not give Britain's southern strategy a single fatal wound. He bled it slowly, from the shadows, until it had nothing left to give Cornwallis when Cornwallis needed it most. When the British Army finally arrived at Yorktown in October 1781, it did so without the reinforced rear it had planned on, without the Loyalist support it had counted on, without the secure supply lines through the Carolinas that the entire strategy had assumed would be in place. Cornwallis surrendered his army of 8,000 men. The war was effectively over. And part of the reason, not the whole reason, but an undeniable part, was that a 50-year-old farmer with a limp had spent 2 years making the British Army fight a war it had no framework to win. Marion's campaign is not simply a colorful story from the American Revolution. It is a template, the same principle, that an occupying force with overwhelming conventional strength struggles badly against an opponent who refuses to fight on the occupier's terms, has resurfaced in different forms in partisan and guerrilla campaigns for the next 2 centuries and beyond. The British in South Carolina in 1780 made the same fundamental error that occupying forces have made repeatedly since. They confused military control of territory with political control of a population. They built forts and garrisoned towns and defeated armies, and found that none of it translated into the willing cooperation of the people who lived between the forts. Marion understood that the countryside was not a passive backdrop to the war. It was the war. The people who knew its swamps, rivers, and back roads were not simply supporting the fighting. They were the fighting. And no amount of conventional military superiority could substitute for the knowledge, the trust, and the willingness to endure that those people brought to the cause. Britain's southern strategy failed not because it was a bad plan by conventional military standards. It failed because it was designed to defeat an army, and it was fighting a population. Francis Marion survived the war. He returned to his plantation. He served in the South Carolina State Senate. He died quietly in 1795, a far less dramatic ending than his wartime legend might suggest. No grand recognition, no monument built in his lifetime, no national celebration of what he had accomplished. It would take more than a century before the Swamp Fox became a name people outside South Carolina recognized. Snow's Island itself is largely reclaimed by the swamp that once hid it, accessible mainly to historians and a handful of state park visitors, quiet and waterlogged, almost exactly as inaccessible now as it was in 1781, a quiet footnote to a campaign that helped change the outcome of a war. The British captured the cities. They held the forts. They controlled the roads. And they lost the war in the country between them, not because they were outfought in the battles that made the dispatches, because they were outthought by a man who understood that the real battlefield was not on any map they were using. Here is the question I want you to take into the comments. Is there a version of Britain's southern strategy that actually works? If Cornwallis had understood what Marion was doing from the beginning, if he had allocated the manpower to truly pacify the countryside before marching north, does the outcome change? Or was the flaw so fundamental that no adjustment could have fixed it? Drop your answer below. I read every comment, and this one has no clean answer, which is exactly why it is worth arguing about. If this story changed how you think about what it actually means to win a war, not just the battles but the ground underneath them, share it with someone. Not because it helps the channel, because the lesson is still being learned today. Subscribe if you are not already here, because next time we are going back to another moment when the most powerful military force in the world couldn't figure out how to fight the enemy it was facing. The swamp is just where this one happened.